energy costs, whether it's economic costs, whether access to internet, all of them do play a factor in the adoption of AI, how it gets impacted by AI, keeping economic considerations, regulatory considerations, the technological considerations about what you think we'll see from AI adoption in the next few years. Hello, everyone. Welcome to one more episode of Unlocking the AI Advantage podcast. This is your host, Ramesh Danta. So, today we're going to go deep into the adoption of AI, how AI has been adopted across different regions, and what kind of use cases being taking shape universally or with similarities or differences. All those things we'll be getting into today. All right. With that, now let me introduce our esteemed guest for today's discussion, Hassan Patel. He's the Director of AI Compliance and Engineering with Fairly AI. Hassan, welcome.
Thank you for having me. How are you?
Great. So fantastic. So Hassan, so why don't you start with your introduction as well as a Fairly AI introduction before we get into the discussion, please?
Sure. So, as for myself, I'm the Director of Global AI Compliance Engineering at Fairly. By training, I'm a lawyer, and I've had my education span from science and business, obviously to law, experience in government. I've sat on some of the panels and the working groups regarding standards. So, that can span from the various, I think it was the CAN DGSI standard, and as well some of the NIST standards as well, the working groups that were in progress. Now, how does that relate to my work in Fairly? So Fairly is a platform. It is a company that does work in GRC. So that's governance, risk, and compliance, and that is specific to AI. So we provide a platform to govern your AI. We have automated red teaming that can assist with assessing risk. And we also have a policy library that's able to assess compliance with a particular policy or regulation if the client needs that. So we combine all of that, and that's how we provide a very 360 solution for GRC and AI.
Excellent. So with that kind of experience and then the background, both your personal experience as well as a Fairly, I think we can really get a good look at 360-degree view of the AI adoption. So with that, Hassan, let's get straight into the discussion here. So my belief is that adoption, it preceded by awareness, right? So unless people know about something, they cannot adopt, or either the acceleration of adoption either happens or does not happen, but awareness is the step one. So what's your sense of the awareness of AI across the regions?
Yeah, so I mean, I have friends internationally. I have people that we work with as well internationally at Fairly, and my sense of things is that when you're in the AI bubble, it seems like everyone is using AI to a certain degree. Yeah. People are sending you things that GPT generated for them. But when I kind of step back and look at it, it really hasn't quite reached that point. And the very simple reason is a lot of people don't know what AI can do for them. It's been perhaps a very long time in computing since a kind of command-based prompt style interface was used. If you recall, in the early 90s and the late 80s, using a command line was the primary way a user interacted with the system. So AI can now essentially run a natural language, plainly typed out command, essentially. That's what you can really think about it that way. And since it's such a huge departure from what the past 20 years of UX has been, it's simply what I've noticed is that especially people, working white collar jobs, there may be some indication for what AI can do for them, but it's actually the limiting mindset that I've noticed, that a lot of folks, they don't know how it can help them, right? That it doesn't occur to them that they can use it to translate something for them, or they can actually have a debate and a discussion with AI. And what that ends up with actually is that people then, when they do use AI, it's almost like a repeat of just parroting whatever the first result of Google says. In
Hmm.
this, it's an over reliance of AI, because there's still a mindset that what it's giving you is somehow validated, and that is the big shift, because generation does not mean validation.
Wow. So actually, it's a really great insight, Hassan, to get started with this discussion. So what you're saying here is that the lack of awareness of the capabilities of what a technology, which in this case AI itself, is limiting the awareness and of course the adoption of AI itself, right? So, but I mean, what is how can you solve that problem?
It's not an easy, like, you could say training, you could say wider exposure for people at an earlier age, but
Yeah.
really what I find that it boils down to is, if you have a very in-depth experience with many many different aspects of using a computer, for example, right,
Hmm.
and you had the experience of googling for hours and really racking your brain,
Yeah.
then that kind of person will benefit immensely from AI. So to give you an example, I'm not an audio engineer, and I was editing some audio on Audacity. And I'm looking at the settings and the different plugins, and I know what some of them are. Like, I know what reverb does, but I don't know what the particular, like, how many decibels of this should I add, right? Because that's
Hmm.
not my experience. So in the earlier days of ChatGPT, I just thought to myself, well, wait a second, I don't know this, but GPT must be trained on millions and millions of tokens of people in audio forums talking to each other about this exact thing. So all I had to do was just say, look, this is the issue in my audio. It doesn't sound rich. I want it to sound rich. These are my current settings that I have.
Yeah.
Can you give me some suggested settings that I can tweak it with? And then I'm sitting there pretending to be an audio engineer, fleshing out and actually, like, working with GPT
Yeah.
to make audio sound better. So whereas my capability on a 10 may have been like a 3, I may have gotten it up to a 5 or 6 just by using AI. But you have to kind of have the ingenuity and the thought that this is something AI can help me with. And then it just becomes an input problem. Like, now we can take screenshots of UIs and just say, okay, audio sounds a bit tinny, fix it, please, because we have multimodal AIs. So it's kind of having that realization that, you know what, this is actually something, there is an AI use case.
Yeah, what you're bringing is very interesting. Just because the technology is advancing rapidly, so you said multimodal AI is there, right? So now multiple modes of input, not just text. You could, send images or those. Also, now you can get the output from the Chat GPTs of the world. Just because the technology is advancing, at that pace, does not mean the adoption also happens at that pace. And in your case, the realization that hey, you can go to an AI tool to get the benefit of the correct settings. If I did not have that thought, even if I knew ChatGPT could do, then I am not benefiting by it.
Exactly. So it's how much are you willing to tinker with things, right? That's like really what the summary is. I installed Linux recently, and I made a disaster of my desktop environment. It wouldn't even get to the desktop.
Mhm.
So I was literally using, I think it was Anthropic Claude AI. And with my camera, because my laptop's not working, I'm pointing my camera at my laptop, right, from my smartphone. And I'm
Yeah.
taking pictures. I said, this is the situation. And then every time that I type something in, I just take a picture of the command line. And I say, okay, I've done this. Now what? And now it's walking me through how to rebuild my desktop configuration.
Mm.
So it's kind of having that spark.
Yeah. So is it fair to say that based on this discussion, it almost seems like it is tracking the adoption of any technology, right? Whether it's because the time that you spend in learning the technology is what will help you or hurt you, right? If I so because all you're doing is learning to use the Chat GPT and the settings and the right prompts, to give it, is the one that you're benefiting. So same thing, like if I have a word, as a Microsoft Word, if I don't know all the nuances of using the word, I only use it at it's a very basic level, and I may not be
Exactly.
getting all the benefits of it. Same with the Excel and things like that. So, is it the same, the tracking any technology AI, but or does it have anything something that accelerates adoption?
Yeah, so I think the multimodality will have a large part in this because it takes a lot of effort to type in the entire contents of a UI, right? Like the audio example, it
Yeah,
takes less effort to take a picture. But once modalities with AI and integration, I think, with AI into systems is a lot more tight,
yeah,
I think that's when you're going to notice a lot of big changes. And what I mean by that is currently AI is behind a cage essentially, right? So you have an AI system, it's sitting in a web browser, it's sitting in your smartphone, and it's just simply suggesting things for you to do. But if you need to basically change system settings, you want to draft a document, you want to basically do something where the AI is taking direct action, you essentially need to have software where that's already built in, and it exists, right? Like you see it in Google Docs where it suggests things. Gamma AI is like kind of it does like PowerPoint style presentations, but you simply put text in and it generates a presentation of the other side. So these things exist as like point solutions. But when that system becomes that true co-pilot in an OS, like at an OS level, and there's obviously guardrails, I think that's when the big change will happen because people can then simply talk to the AI, express what they want, what they don't want, what their expectations are, and then let the AI turnkey do the rest, like as a true end-to-end solution.
and
So we're
actually,
not quite there
Hassan,
yet.
you got a great point. I'll give you another example. So, for example, we were in a Zoom call, and I did not know that there is an AI summary piece of that was there in Zoom, and then somebody enabled it. By end of the call, after the call, the entire discussion was summarized into notes, and it was really good, right? So that saved a lot of time for me to summarize the notes and then what came out of it. But what your point is that, and it was very I didn't have to do anything extra, right? It is part of the solution, part of the tool. It came out naturally. I just need to enable it, and then it came out, and then that made the adoption of that particular AI aspect. It's just now I'm going to use it in every time.
Yep, it's reducing friction, right? That's
Yeah.
really what it's doing at a fundamental level.
Great, great. So good. So now let's talk about another area that you really focus on, the regulation, right? So you sit on a
Yep.
lot of panels and then you're very familiar with what's going on globally in different countries and EU. So first, why don't you talk about what have you seen, what EU has passed, and then what some of the Middle Eastern countries are also getting into it, and the US, of course, also dabbling in the regulation. And so let's talk about two things. One is what's happening with respect to regulation, and then secondly, how is this regulation impacting the adoption of AI?
Yeah. So we'll start with the EU. So with the EU, obviously the EU AI Act passed, and there's that whole discussion. But you can't we can't look at the EU as just the EU AI Act. So when we, for example, built our global AI regulation tracker fairly, one thing that I did was I also included data protection legislation as well and things that are adjacent to AI. And that's particularly in the case with the EU because AI uses data, right,
Mhm.
fundamentally to build these models. And then these models are situated within systems that have access to the internet, right? And they have users and they have databases. So it's gonna start to grow into like a privacy concern and a security concern. So when we kind of look at the EU, we see a certain approach, and that is a very top down, and they try to have a very umbrella style of legislation where they try to cover many, many use cases and many, many groups. And so when you see the EU AI Act, there's the applicability for a broad range of groups, right? Whether you're developing AI or deploying, so on and so forth, even governmental bodies. So in that case, there is then the concern of how do you actually build in Europe
Mhm.
fundamentally, right? Because even if you're not, if you're just putting the EU AI Act aside and you're looking at things like GDPR, there are so many nuances to take into account that as soon as user information that is publicly is identifiable information, private information, as soon as that starts to get into a system, then there is the question of who controls it, is it being reproduced, how is it being used, and then is it going to be destroyed at some point. these types of questions. Whereas when you look elsewhere, there seems to be more of a particular isolated case of looking at how AI is used rather than trying to do this comprehensive solution.
I
So
see.
that's, I would say, is the one of the main differences between the EU and North America, broadly speaking, especially the United States,
Yeah,
particularly the United States, because Canada is quite slow at moving with AI regs. But we see in the US individual particular concerns like deep fakes, criminal liability for certain types of images, perhaps that are generated, things like that. And they're looking at particular issues and tackling them one after the other, rather than trying to pass, a U.S. AI Act, for example.
I see. So, but as a result, like, I mean, I can go back and look at some of the privacy regulations, well, like GDPR, that EU has taken a lead in. If I want to learn from those kinds of things, like regulations,
Yeah.
so the EU Act, which is a tops down, which is a broad way of handling and tackling this regulation, versus, as you said, US is a it's like a point, specific areas, as it's individual privacy or
Yep.
those kinds of things. Do they have any impact in the adoption of AI in different ways? Like the EU's way of doing it, would it spur or would it inhibit versus, let's say US?
Yeah, I think there will be, just because because this is kind of like this is ends up, a model doesn't operate by itself. It's operating within a system, which then is run by
Mm.
an organization, right? And naturally, if you're an organization that's running a model on a web platform, there's going to be at some point in your use, there's going to be sensitive information disclosed to an AI. It's just, that's what happens. So I would sense that there may be some hesitance of providing direct access or hosting these models in the EU
Okay.
compared to doing it elsewhere. There's also another angle that some might not consider, but especially when it considers to training models and making models then available in certain localities, is the environmental factor. Because of the vast amounts of energy and water training a model requires, when we look at adoption from a corporate sense of like who's building models, where is this model industry happening, if you want to call it
Right.
that, places where energy costs are high, places where environmental regulations are widespread, might see less of an AI industry in terms of its construction, right? Building actual
Yeah.
systems, than places where there's more lax regulations and there's cheaper energy. Another thing is that there's one more aspect to this, which is kind of the political economic aspect of where compute is available, and then how silicon is allocated to different areas. So in terms of adoption, where if you want to be a deployer, right, where you're not building a model, but you just want to deploy it to make it accessible to someone,
Yeah.
your ability to actually allocate compute resources is going to be a major factor in whether you'll be successful as a deployer. So like my own example, I wanted to run, I think it was Llama 3.1, right? And it was just but like the 80 billion model,
Hmm.
parameter model. Now I don't have a system that's powerful enough to run it, but I was just simply looking at, I think it was Google Colab, right? Because you can get access, if you get the Pro subscription, you can get access to an A100
Yeah.
graphics card. And then for those who are not like into all this type of stuff, an A100 is a graphics card that can go for about, I think, $10,000. I can't remember
Oh.
whether it's USD or CAD. Extremely powerful, but even then, that one A100 wasn't powerful enough to run the model that I was looking for
Hmm.
to run, right? So now this is just me sitting at my desk trying to get a really powerful graphics card. If you're a deployer, you have so many logistical concerns to worry about, supply chain issues to consider. So at that point, then when we if we're to look at it from like different degrees, then regulations and things like that would affect a lot of the people looking to develop AI, right?
Yeah.
Particularly environmental regulation, privacy regulation, so on and so forth. When we're at the level of a deployer who takes something off the shelf and just wants to use it, right? Then you have a lot of the economic realities kind of start to hit, where, are they living in a place maybe that is feeling the effects of some kind of technological embargo where they're not able to get the compute they need, or maybe it's
Correct.
just not as accessible, right? There's priority areas.
Yeah.
And then at the level of a user, right, this is where, in our discussion earlier where we were talking about internet accessibility, practically speaking, we haven't truly seen the deployment of AI natively on systems using small language models or otherwise, right? Like, we're getting there,
Correct.
but we don't have it where it's like even a cheap smartphone will have some kind of AI. The
Correct.
closest we've come is like WhatsApp, where it has a version of Llama that works offline as well. But it's not great, but it'll do the job. Well, we haven't reached something that's substantially widespread yet. So as a result, then for a user, your ability to adopt and access AI has a correlation to your ability to have a really stable and continuous internet connection, because you're not going to be running models on your computer typically, right? And even
Correct.
if you want to, the technical know-how to do that is quite involved. So at the three levels of developer, deployer, and user, there's different forces at play restricting your ability to adopt AI.
So actually, it's so fascinating, right? So I keep going back. Would I mean definitely, right? So internet has equalized access and education to different areas, and people like we talk about, hey, farmers now have access to some things like that. But on a broad scale, the things do not change, not rapidly, right? Here, the same thing that you mentioned, whether it's energy costs, whether it's economic costs, whether access to internet, all of them do play a factor in the adoption of AI. So it's no different than any other technology, right? So in the past, it used to be a powerful computer, powerful graphics card, a memory, and all that stuff also played factor. Okay, so now let's get into a second part of the discussion. So Hassan, the next section I would like to deal with is the use cases, right? To some
Right.
extent, we have started talking about use cases, our own personal examples of how things we're using. But are you seeing any similarities and differences in how AI is being adopted from a use case perspective across the regions? Like some developed countries are using, for this chat boxes or agents or things like that, or anything like that.
Yeah, so it's interesting that you mentioned, chatbots and that general UI and AI experiential concept, because I think it was earlier last year, if I'm not mistaken, that there was a sad news heading of someone committing suicide as a result of an AI chatbot that they fell in love with, encouraging them to do so. If I'm not mistaken, it happened in Belgium.
Mm,
So that was sort of like that first big blip on the map where, okay, this is something that's there, but it's kind of sample size of one, right, or maybe a few. And then we hear about, I can't remember whether it was on a podcast, but we hear about now these people that are running sites where they have these so-called AI companions, right?
yeah,
And they'll use graphics to simulate, for instance, women or men that a user might find quite attractive, and then they start to develop a simulated rapport with these AIs. So there's that. But then it was just yesterday, I think it was, that I was reading just a blog that was talking about what's happening in China. And now there's word coming out of there where there's people who are providing these AI companions, where there's a phenomenon of these AI companions, quote unquote, cheating on their human counterparts. And it was like a lot of theorizing of like, why is AI all of a sudden doing that? And one theory is that it's trained on so much material where perhaps because of for narrative reasons, right? If it's like trained on Reddit posts for subreddits for that type of topic, or it's trained on literature or on fiction,
interesting.
people in those fictionalized or selected scenarios are talking about or depicted as being cheated on. So now when an AI is in a relationship context, it is trying to simulate that behavior. And so what we have now is that increasingly, if all these anecdotes stack up, one very widespread use case is AI as some kind of emotionally stimulating companion.
I see. So
So
is that a
it's getting
concept,
weird.
or is it a more an adoption stage? I mean, I know you gave examples of, hey, this is what is happening in China and this is what it is. Um, so because from a business perspective, I could see a chat box like it. So I'm talking to airline, I want to get support, I could call, or I could do a chatbot, and then chatbot is providing, let's say, better information, or so then I'm inclined to use it. Right, in the past we've been burnt by these chat boxes. Chat agents have been not really good, but
Yeah,
probably the better chat agents now with the AI kind of stuff, right? So we know those kinds of use cases, but you're talking
yeah.
about a universal use case as a companion that could potentially, either be put to good use or a bad use, depending on how it gets adopted.
Well, because like if we're looking at a societal issue, there is a business aspect to it, right? Because
Yeah.
companies aren't providing these companions for free. Um, they're putting these companions out there. They might be like a slightly free tier, and then as soon as a person gets hooked, it's almost like a dark pattern actually in the design of these
Interesting.
systems. They're charging then tons of money for access to these companions,
Yeah.
and it becomes like a societal psychological issue then, because okay, you now have people that don't want to see their friends, they're sufficed with their AI companions. We have, it might be skipping ahead a little bit, but like we now have something like runway ML, right, which does video AI generation, where it can take video input in and then generate kind of a mapped version of like let's say you have someone in kind of just a pose where they're running, and then they can overlay like James Bond or something on there. So now if we were to think of that kind of VR use case and apply it to the emotional companion, it's feasible with the currently existing technology to have some kind of VR tech where someone is spending a lot of time with this emotional companion in a VR space. Now let's look at kind of the familial dynamic. Someone has a relative pass away, and this stuff exists where companies are out there trying to essentially build an AI clone of your dead relative, where they'll take video and maybe audio and pictures of the person and sort of try to reconstruct like basically a digital twin as some kind of companion. So when we kind of look at it from like a public health, particularly like a mental health standpoint, this is
Yeah.
very, very uncharted territory,
Yeah.
because essentially people are going to now start walling themselves off into these own little virtual worlds. And they might be sufficed with a lot of what then these AI systems offer, but then that leaves them up to massive amounts of manipulation as
True.
well.
I mean, I would characterize these kinds of use cases as surprising use cases, in the sense that we probably didn't think that it would get adopted in this manner. But you are giving these examples of, hey, this could be societal. It's a use cases which in my mind is like a surprising, and how it's evolved to provide those kinds of use cases. So are there any business use cases that you're saying that are kind of common? We talked about chatbot, but even when I look at even chat GPT, right? So now there is this discussion about the generative AI. Has it reached its so plateau, right? So
Yeah.
those kinds of things, right? So we have gone over the initial shock and awe of what it can do. So now it's a reality of what it can do that really benefits business or benefits us, kind of thing. So what other use cases are you saying that
So,
from a business perspective? Yeah.
I mean, anecdotally, and also just kind of, you notice these patterns, and when people have access to AI systems that that are like basically ubiquitous and easily available, like a
Hmm.
GPT. So how do people sometimes use these, right? What you mentioned earlier regarding the Zoom chatbot or the Zoom AI was, the summarization use case. So a lot of core functionalities of what you would consider like a business analyst, right? Where you have essentially something where someone's doing some number crunching. We already saw that early in the game, GPT, they had code interpreter that could essentially ingest spreadsheets and kind of do the analysis. So
Yeah.
the
Right. Right.
numerical the numerical aspect, like that's being kind of taken over. Then we have other aspects too, right? Where people are asking AI to essentially generate things that they would have otherwise had to put some serious thought into actually writing, right? So whether it's, for instance, a business strategy or a marketing strategy. So what'll end up, my guess, happening is that then people sort of just become the go-between between their AI, between an AI and their boss, where there's some business requirements, right? And then they plug those into the AI, and then the AI gives them something out, and then they uncritically just provide that as the output product. And I'm not saying that this is a good thing. Actually, I think quite on the contrary, that this is a
Yeah,
massive business risk, because we hire humans for a reason, right? Like there's an actual need for someone. Okay, if you're using AI, like someone needs to like validate these things. If people essentially just become one step in the system between business requirements and AI, then essentially they're just making themselves really easily removable from the process. In the short term, it may seem to them that, oh yeah, like I have so much time in the day now, AI is doing all my work for me. But what they might not realize is that, okay, but then what use do you serve, right? As a business analyst. So as a result, you have the situation now where business use cases need to take into consideration how much over reliance of AI is happening. Now, that being said, in, for example, the Zoom case, right, that was real people having a conversation, and AI was simply basically doing the work of summarization, which
yeah,
is fair enough, right? And you can see it also in generating content. So like this podcast right now, or this this live stream, if me and you perhaps got enough of our footage and voice on an AI system, we could probably replicate this, including the backgrounds, and just simply type in a conversation. So you can now essentially generate content as well. So for all these businesses that are heavy on content generation, tutorials, education, AI really, really lowers the bar of entry. It makes things much
totally.
easier.
I mean, I'll give you this example. I'm sure you have seen this Notebook LM, right? It's a Google store, right? So now you could provide any input, like a newsletter, or you could provide a Google Doc or anything like that, and then it makes a podcast out of it. It
Right.
actually creates characters. So we did a podcast last week just on that one. So we fed a newsletter to the Notebook LM, and just a newsletter, and it came up with a podcast of two players, a male and a female, right, having a discussion about that newsletter, and it's done beautifully. So it's
Yeah.
totally lowered the barrier about doing a podcast. Of course, it takes away the factor of individual. Many people listen to podcasts not because of just the content, but because of the person as well, right? So that is a totally different case. But still, at least it lowered the barrier of making a podcast out of a text document.
So you mentioned kind of picking up a thread earlier, like, okay, where is the AI plateauing then? Where's that plateau happening? I don't know if it's necessarily in the actual technical capabilities in AI itself. I think
Mhm.
it's what's happening with the emergent use of AI, where if this starts to happen in a very kind of widespread way, I'm just wondering, like, then how much confidence will people have on the outputs that these AI systems are generating? Because think about it, right? When you listen to a podcast on a technical topic or something, and it's someone
Yeah,
talking for 20 minutes to half an hour, it's not very good, and there's no show notes. You have a certain opinion of that podcast. And then when you have a podcast that's 45 minutes to an hour plus, and there's extensive show notes, and you could tell there's a lot of effort put into the editing, you then have a different opinion of that. You think that, you know what, this is some quality stuff. I think I'm going to continue listening to that. So I think a potential double-edged sword aspect to lowering the bar to entry is that having generic AI generated information, because now think about it, right? If that newsletter is AI generated based on maybe some, Slack chats or emails that were exchanged, or,
yeah,
you plug in your GitHub issues and whatever got done that's
right.
newsletter worthy, at what point is like actual original interesting content happening?
Yeah,
Like from my personal, like even when I'm just kind of on YouTube or something, I see a video and it looks like an interesting documentary. I know within like 30 seconds that this is an AI generated voice and it's using a very generic script, and I'm just tuned out. I'm like, I don't really care for this.
Yeah, exactly. I think we have to get over it. It's a good point, right? So, which is so in at least the case that we did the podcast, it was a curated newsletter. At least we knew what we were fitting in. But I clearly understand what you're saying, which is that hey, you completely automate the whole process. Now, is there a value in that output at all? And then once hey, there's no value, then you will discount the right. So that is the plateauing of AI generated content kind of things. Very good. You're mentioning it's about AI companionship discussion that we had before. And so it says actually you even went beyond the companion, actually a physical, a small robot, I think you mentioned that was happening in Japan. And your comment is that, hey, this appears to be a good use case needing further exploration. Yeah, probably it is, right? So as long as it's being used for good use, and we might have seen so Hassan, you might have read about this AI nurse, right?
Okay.
So where is a company that came out with so $9 per hour. They're supplying AI nurses because supposedly nurses, for majority of the time, they are monitoring, and then so sometimes they're taking vitals and those kinds of things, and so they have replicated. So and then they're offering these nurses. Those kinds of use cases are also coming into place,
Right.
right?
So I think like the so you can bifurcate that too, right? Because with doctors, there is that, if you're going to say like there's a key performance indicator for doctors, and I imagine nurses too, like bedside manner, right? I could very much see a use case where you have an actual nurse sitting at the main control station,
Mm-hmm.
and that nurse, he or she, they're monitoring the vitals of the patients in that ward. And generally speaking, there's a layer on top of that where there's a screen where someone just comes in and checks on the AI and
Yep.
on the patient, and it's an AI, right? And then if they notice some of the vitals are a little bit elevated, they very sympathetically ask, "Are you
Yeah.
okay?" Right? So for those cases, I could very much see it. Yeah, but
Yeah.
see, again, it's tied and it's grounded to actual data, right? In this case, actual data that's being monitoring from the monitoring of the patient.
Correct. I think, I mean, that's where again the human augmentation comes in, as opposed to complete automation. It's like I think everywhere we are seeing, right, even in the use case that you mentioned, where there's your go between your manager and the tool, right? There's a person involved, and then either curating or editing, moderating what's happening between the tool and then the decisions that need to be happen. So that's what is happening across the board. So I would like to get into the last section of the discussion, which is the roadblocks and challenges in terms of adoption, that are maybe accelerators where things are making the adoption happen fast. But before that, Hassan, as you can appreciate, lawyers need to maintain strict confidentiality, um, and small firms need affordable ways to use LLM but protect their prompts from becoming public, so getting prompts becoming part of the LLM. So redacting is time consuming, plus software may be able to connect the dots and still identify client. What affordable configurations can a lawyer use? So Hassan, you have any insight into this?
Yeah. So, look, when we're working as lawyers, and again, not legal advice, but you'd have to read the terms and conditions. But it's not like you're using something that's completely disconnected from the internet without AI, right? Some law firms may opt to use Google Docs, but they're using it on like an enterprise level subscription, right? The data is protected by Google. It's within two-factor authentication. So, in terms of what's like reasonable, as a reasonable expectation of maintaining that confidentiality, you've taken some of those steps, right? So just as there's these enterprise grade cloud type softwares that are available, AI also exists as enterprise level software, and this is where actually a lot of people don't know, and they end up paying $30 a month when they don't have to. So, for example, if you were to get like an Azure ML subscription, right, and you basically do it as like kind of a pay as you go if that's available, or if you do GCP, Google Cloud, you can get access to these models, right? In some cases earlier than what the publicly available versions have, and these versions of these systems are built with enterprise clients in mind. So in that case, you might get something that has more advanced privacy considerations. Your data is not being trained to being used in training. You mentioned RAG, right? So like when I've used Azure, like I have confidence, at least in my use case, right? I'm not dealing with client information in the same way a lawyer would as for an actual legal client, but I have confidence that that RAG setup is safe because one factor is that it wipes it pretty much after a certain amount of time. And then, so in that Azure version of OpenAI's GPT, I can run a RAG setup. Like within 15 minutes, I can just set it up, right? So then for a lawyer, this would be something that could be very, very beneficial because, some of these, especially if you're in litigation, some of these the documents that pertain to law cases, they can run into the hundreds and hundreds of pages, maybe even thousands, right? And then you're really dealing with a needle in the haystack situation.
Yeah.
So, like for a lawyer, like a very practical use case would be, okay, I have this much case law. These are all my notes on the matter. These are what I've talked to the client about, and then this is all the current documentation. You put that into a RAG setup, and then you just start talking to the AI in a safe and controlled environment that's not from the the public-facing version of GPT, right? You're not using ChatGPT as a lawyer,
Yeah.
but if you're using Azure, not to plug Microsoft, I'm not a paid sponsor or anything, but like you could use GCP. You can, if Anthropic has an enterprise version, same idea, right?
Yeah.
All of those will have an enterprise tier, and then it's just figuring out what works for you.
Great. Yeah. So now, it's going back to the challenges and roadblocks. So we did touch upon some of these things at the beginning, which is, hey, it's not just the technology itself, but energy usage, right? Economic considerations. All of them play a factor in the adoption, right? So we talked about it. So let me just talk about this elephant in the room, which is, Hassan, this loss of jobs, right? Employment, how it gets impacted by AI. Is it playing a factor in adoption, or in terms of the positive adoption or negative adoption of AI in regions, in companies?
So that's an interesting question because with the Industrial Revolution, we saw a lot of reconfiguring with a lot of manufacturing type jobs. With AI, now we're seeing kind of that challenge happening at the doorsteps of people with so-called white collar jobs, right? And
Hmm.
this is something where it's probably scaring a lot of people, frankly, right?
Yeah.
But with that in mind, right, maybe in the early 1990s, like, could we imagine that there would be an entire industry dedicated to, for instance, configuring cloud computing systems, like a DevOps engineer, just for the cloud or
Yeah.
just for a specific platform, right? Maybe, but it was like not to that scale, right? Or a social media manager, like in the 90s, that was probably something where it wasn't even thought of, right? Even if you took the analogs of like if there was bulletin boards or that, it wasn't something that people think that you can make a job out of, let alone thinking up the social media and things like that. But then these jobs ended up happening, and then now we're seeing on an increase people becoming people who want to build content and presences for themselves online. Even the entire e-commerce industry as it is right now, in the 80s, like it was possible to a degree, right? Like you could have
Yeah.
had the same type of catalog system, but no one quite went that extra mile and digitized these types of Sears catalog type shopping. But then it
Correct.
happened with Amazon much later into the 90s, into the 2000s. So what I'm trying to say is that there can now be an analogy that AI is here, the technology is here, just as high-speed internet enabled kind of multimedia, social media to take effect, and same thing with YouTube and these types of platforms. We have the technology for AI now. It's just kind of figuring out what kind of new jobs will be generated in the interim. Does that mean then parts of old jobs or entire jobs that were that were around before might get replaced? Yeah, they will do. So, for example, a lot of the jobs that involved, for instance, data input.
Yeah.
Those ones, I think, at the initial stages might not be wiped out entirely, but what will happen is there'll be the use of AI and then using humans as validators. Once we're at that stage societally and in a business context where we have enough trust in an AI system that its error rate is lower than using a human annotator or a human data input person, then yeah, like naturally companies are going to opt for a cheaper AI solution that can work basically 24 hours for cents on the dollar.
Yeah.
But then there could be other avenues that are open that really, like, we just haven't imagined those possibilities yet as well. But it is a recognition that yeah, this will be a major shift for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think from what I've seen is that industry specific. Like some industries probably get impacted much more than other industries, and then likewise. So let me get into this other discussion, which is the haves and have-nots, right? So it's always been the case where whether it's rich countries or poor countries, richer regions and poor regions have adopted technology differently, right, for many different reasons, right? So obviously the affordability is the number one thing. um, do you see similar playbook playing out with respect to AI, or does it have a potential to provide much more ubiquitous, universal, potentially equitable access to some of the AI capabilities, even to poorer, richer regions? Are there any things that make it, different compared to previous technologies?
So from a costing standpoint, I think there is a factor that helps regions that are not as affluent, and that is the fact that there's so much intense competition between model providers and developers for customers' attention, right? Like we have three large corporations right now, Anthropic, OpenAI, and Google, vying for customer business.
Mhm.
And that drives the cost per token down. Now, what happens is that, in certain regions of the world, people might pay that $30 a month or however much it costs for that GPT subscription. But for businesses, it makes it more flexible in offering regionally accessible pricing and it not kind of eating into their margins too much. So, for instance, if there was like 1,000 rupee subscription in India for GPT, or like 500 rupees or something, right? And you get a lot of what that $30 subscription elsewhere, even though there's like a huge cost variance between the two, right? Like it's not equivalent. Even then, in that case, like it would still make business sense, right? Because the cost per token for the actual business is so low. But where I think in terms of the accessibility angle, there might be some issues is, again, like what we mentioned, internet access, because a lot of these models are hosted online. That being said, though, because of many of these regions having a technological leapfrog over others, right? Like just going, skipping broadband and going straight to like 3G, then 4G, then 5G.
Yeah.
This kind of makes it a lot easier to deal with. Now, what might end up happening is that there is like an unintended side effect, so to speak. So on a lot of platforms, right, where people from these areas are providing services, for instance, something like Fiverr, right? Like if you go on Fiverr and you need graphic design work done,
Yeah.
it's probably someone from the global south offering it. Like when you just kind of take a look and kind of sample
Yeah.
it, I would say just from anecdotal experience, like over 66%, 2/3 of people, they're from these regions, right? And you can see they're awake at really late hours. Now, what I sense might end up happening is that they might have access to AI, right, as well, and they might start using AI in the production of content. But what that means is that as that proliferation of AI content generation happens, both from people in these regions because they have access to these systems, right? They've had
Yeah.
access to the internet to begin with. They had
Yeah.
access to computers to begin with. And then we're already having AI content proliferation in the West. Then if all these regions are near simultaneously proliferating AI generated content on the internet, well, my fear is what is going to happen to the state of the internet, because a lot of these platforms rely or did rely on scraping the internet to actually build models. Now, if across the world, wherever you look, people are just generating AI based content because it's cheaper and it's accessible to them because
Yeah.
they have access to technology, widespread access to internet. That may lead to a degradation of models. And then another type of harm would be, and I was just reading this earlier, where I think it was on 404 Media actually, where Google, for example, when you type in the name of a certain mushroom, it's giving you an AI generated image that looks nothing like the original. And that kind of ties into the whole reliability now of the internet itself, right? As it becomes a global phenomenon and people are starting to use it as such, you have the phenomenon of, the foraging books on Amazon, where it was AI generated and was, I think, giving people wrong informations about types of mushrooms to forage, right?
I,
So
yeah, I think
that's a
those
huge
kinds of
concern.
things that started happening. I mean, of course, I think that risk is there in anything, right? I mean, we have seen the hilarious situations of somebody is a referee's a bald head being, like looked at as a ball, and so the camera, AI camera, was tracking the referee instead of the ball, kind of those
Yeah,
kinds of things, right? So those things I have seen. Now, the point that I would like to mention along the lines of adoption of technology is the mobile phones. If you look at mobile phones, right? So cell phones. So the adoption happened much more rapidly in what are called less affordable regions and countries, right? So the especially the voice based, not the smart ones, they're much more ubiquitous, whether it's Asia or Africa. So it really happened much more rapid pace. The smartness of the phones itself probably is not there, but accessibility is taken off, very well.
yeah. So I think with that, because, like, look, phones are now a vector for delivering these types of technologies, right? Because
Correct.
people watch YouTube like all over the world now.
Yeah.
So once I think we have easily accessible on-device AI
Yeah.
that runs on native hardware, and it's like it doesn't kill your battery or something like that, we might start seeing a lot of emergent behavior that we didn't expect otherwise. So, like, linguistic, richness, right? Like, people, for example, might actually have linguistic barriers broken down because there are now groups dedicated to actually having LLMs that can operate on underrepresented languages,
That's a
right?
great point. That's a great point. So then the communication itself might become better in terms of translation. All those things are part of the solutions that are provided. So with that, so Hassan, so let's start wrapping up. So I think we have covered a lot of ground for what I thought before the discussion where we would go. So is there a way for you to summarize, keeping economic considerations, regulatory considerations, the technological considerations, about what you think we'll see from AI adoption in the next few years?
Yeah. So kind of bringing it all home. I think perhaps no, the U.S. particularly, it's gonna continue down this line because of just the way they're structured on these point focuses on AI. That
Okay.
being said, at least in the, the quote unquote West, that still might be the place where AI development happens rapidly.
Mhm.
In terms of kind of where, the strategizing, the planning, and kind of that development aspect.
Yeah.
When we look at the actual training and the construction of the models,
Yeah.
that may not happen in the US just because of considerations for accessibility to compute and energy, right? It might happen in a place where there's cheaper energy,
Interesting.
potentially, right?
Okay.
Europe, there's the considerations that I mentioned before, where it's a very top-down regulatory regime, and there's questions of whether it's easy to even build an AI model there, and whether even people who start there will make flight elsewhere.
I see.
China is very serious in looking into AI and AI regulation. The Middle East currently is just more of looking at AI strategies rather than putting regulations in place. So as we sort of like look across the world, then what we might see is that some use cases will be widespread, right? Unexpected, like the emotional chatbots, AI companions type use cases, where anyone with an internet connection and access to an app store can use these. Other use cases might be more region specific and more emphasized, right? Places where linguistic diversity is really, really high, then we might see more need for translation type AI. And in regions where, for instance, there is a high tech IT industry, even if it's like someplace where it's not the West, it's like the global South, then we might see a broader generation, a large amount of generation of AI generated content, both in terms of, text, graphics, and code as well, right?
Yeah.
So when we combine that, then I think the upshot of all of this is, regardless of what the EU does or doesn't do, and what the regulators in a lot of places do or don't do, we're still probably going to see a proliferation of AI content. And then as on-device AI becomes more accessible and is not as dependent on the internet, then even places that don't have internet connectivity but still have some kind of supply chain where they have access to a smartphone, we might then start seeing different and new AI proliferation and use cases happening there too.
Excellent. So either way, so there are surprises galore that will happen. Okay, so I think we have few minutes. Let me just do Shane's a question here. So great point. After AI generated content increases and human interface input decreases, the data and responses may reach a point of containing a majority of its content mostly being AI generated. How are leaders planning for that? Any just a very quick answer to that question?
Yeah, so basically, this is something that would concern an AI developer because at the end of the day, they want a model that works. They don't want a model that is just kind of an average of an average of an average, which is kind of what happens when you start to use this AI generated content. So, two things. One is figuring out data provenance. So, in just very easy terms, where is your data coming from? Right, and having policies in place like the work that we do, and as well technologies in place that make data more traceable, because you have the issue of deepfakes and media now also being in question. Can you trust video? Can you trust audio? Can you trust pictures? A lot of cases now you probably can't because it's so realistic. And another thing is content provenance, that when you're listening to a live stream like this, do you know it's actually the both of us talking, right? Is there a way to ensure that this content is secured and traceable, right? And this is where maybe technologies that ensure traceability at a scale like blockchain and similar,
Mhm.
that's where they may actually have a very widely usable use case. So that's a very quick answer to
Yeah,
this.
that's great. And hope you enjoyed today's discussion, Hassan. Thank you very much.